They called her the widow, with the death sentence hanging around her neck. 4 times she'd stood at the altar. 4 times she'd made vows. 4 times she'd buried a husband, each grave marker another brick in the wall of gossip and suspicion that surrounded her name. Millbrook wasn't a large town, but it was small enough that everyone knew. Small enough that whispers followed her down Main Street like shadows. Women clutched their husbands closer when she passed. Mothers warned their daughters to stay away. The preacher himself seemed uncomfortable offering her the sympathies of God. Cursed, they called her. Not always to her face, but the word followed her everywhere. In the spaces between conversations. In the careful distance people kept. In the way men would decline invitations to dance, would make excuses, would suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere whenever she was near. Her name was Eleanor. But nobody called her that anymore. They called her the Black Widow, the Death Bride, the woman who buries husbands like. Some women plant gardens. She'd learned to accept the cruelty with the same quiet resignation she'd learned to accept the grief. Both were constant. Both were inescapable. Both had become as familiar as the weight of her own skin. But Eleanor didn't know that everything was about to change. She didn't know that a stranger was riding into Millbrook with a reputation just as dark and a heart just as broken. She didn't know that sometimes the only person brave enough to love you is someone who's already lost everything too. She didn't know that this time the curse was about to meet its match. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1887 was the kind that settled into a place and refused to leave. Millbrook, Wyoming sat buried under 3 feet of snow that had turned gray and compacted from constant traffic. Eleanor Hartwell stood in the window of her boarding room on the 2nd floor of the Riverside Inn, watching the street below with the detachment of someone, observing a world she was no longer quite part of. She was 32 years old and felt 90. Her reflection stared back at her from the cold glass, a woman with dark hair, showing the first threads of premature silver, with eyes that had learned to absorb sorrow without flinching, with a mouth that had forgotten how to genuinely smile. Behind her the room was small and sparse, a narrow bed with a quilt she'd mended twice, a dresser holding the few possessions she'd managed to salvage from multiple lives, a Bible that had traveled with her through 4 marriages and had become worn in different places each time, as if God kept redirecting her to different psalms, depending on which husband she was burying. The town below was stirring. Saturday morning, which meant business. The mercantile would be crowded. Women would gather in clusters, and Eleanor would be the reason those clusters suddenly broke apart, reforming at a safer distance. Men would tip their hats out of habit and propriety, but their eyes would slide away from hers. The judgment was silent, but absolute. Eleanor had arrived in Millbrook 5 years ago as Mrs. Charles Hartwell, a widow with a 2-year-old daughter named Sophie, and a sum of money that Charles's family had sent her with a note suggesting she remake her life somewhere they would never have to see her face. Charles had died of influenza in Chicago. The Hartwells blamed Eleanor for marrying him, blamed her somehow for not being able to save him. She'd changed her surname to Hartwell intentionally. She'd learned that leaving behind the names of dead husbands was like trying to outrun your own shadow. Eventually the shadow catches up. But the pretense of distance, however false, helped her sleep at night. Charlie had been her 2nd husband, the death that had first earned her the whispers. Before Charlie, there had been Marcus Holloway. They'd married when she was 18 years old in Omaha. He was a merchant who promised her a life of stability and security. Instead, he'd promised her a life of confusion and pain. 3 years into their marriage, he'd ridden his horse into a ravine on an ordinary Tuesday for no reason anyone could explain. The horse survived. Marcus didn't. Her family had called it an accident. His family had called it suicide. The town had called it Eleanor's curse. Then came Thomas Brennan, a railroad man who'd believed her when she told him the truth about Marcus's death. Thomas had been kind. Thomas had been patient. Thomas had loved Sophie from the moment Eleanor introduced them. Thomas had promised her a fresh start in a new town where nobody knew her story. Thomas had lasted 3 years before a boiler explosion at the rail yard took him from her on a Tuesday afternoon that would have seemed ordinary except for the way it shattered everything she'd been rebuilding. And then Charlie, the Chicago merchant with the gentle hands, and the family that hated her more than they loved their own son. 4 husbands, 4 funerals, 4 sets of grieving families who'd looked at her with eyes full of accusation, barely concealed beneath courtesy. Eleanor wasn't religious, exactly, but she'd stopped fighting against the idea that perhaps the town was right. Perhaps there was something wrong with her. Perhaps love itself was the curse, and any man foolish enough to bind himself to her was sealing his own fate. She'd been alone for almost 2 years now. Just her and Sophie, who was 9 years old and had learned to make herself invisible at school, claiming she had no father when other children asked, because it was easier than trying to explain the complicated mathematics of Eleanor's matrimonial history. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor turned from the window to find Mrs. Patterson, the inn's owner, standing in the doorway with a concerned expression that Eleanor had learned to recognize as genuine. Mrs. Patterson was one of the few people in Millbrook who didn't believe in the curse. Or if she did, she'd decided it wasn't Eleanor's fault. "You have a visitor downstairs," Mrs. Patterson said carefully. "A gentleman. He's asking for you specifically." Eleanor frowned. She knew no one in Millbrook well enough to receive visitors. Her interactions were polite but distant, calculated to give the town nothing new to discuss. Did he give a name? "Thomas Garrett. He owns the Redemption Ranch about 30 miles north of here. Says he has business in town and heard about you from a mutual acquaintance." Eleanor's instinct was to refuse. A stranger, looking for her by name, in a town that already watched her like hawks circling wounded prey. Nothing good ever came from that combination, but something in her, some small spark of the person she'd been before loss had become her primary occupation, made her stand, made her smooth her skirts, made her check her reflection one more time in the glass before descending the stairs. Thomas Garrett was waiting in the parlor, and Eleanor's first impression was of darkness. He was a tall man, probably in his mid-40s, with the weathered look of someone who spent his days in unforgiving weather. His suit was good quality but worn, expensive but not ostentatiously so. His face was handsome, in a way that seemed almost accidental, like good looks had been granted to him, and he'd never quite decided what to do with them. But it was his eyes that struck her most. They were a grey that reminded her of winter mornings, and they held something she recognized immediately because she saw it in her own reflection daily. They held the weight of having survived things that should have broken him. When he saw her, something flickered across his expression. Recognition, maybe, or just the satisfaction of confirming what he'd heard was true. "Mrs. Eleanor," he said, rising. He didn't call her widow or add any qualifying adjective. Just her name, delivered with a respect that felt almost dangerous in its ordinariness. "Mr. Garrett, I'm told you're from the Redemption Ranch." She remained standing, a subtle barrier between them. "I'm not sure how I can help a stranger. I came to see if the rumors were true." He studied her with a frankness that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. "They said there was a woman in this town that everyone feared, though she'd done nothing to deserve it. They said she was kind to the children at school, but eaten alive by the children of gossip. They said she was beautiful, but had learned to hide it, because beauty combined with tragedy made people suspicious." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. "And are the rumors true?" Thomas Garrett smiled, and it was the saddest smile she'd ever seen on a living human face. "Half true. You're not being eaten alive by gossip. You're surviving it. There's a difference. But yes, everything else is accurate enough. Why would a stranger care about any of this?" He moved to the window, looking out at the same street Eleanor had been watching just minutes before. "Because I understand what it's like to be the town's villain through no fault of your own. I've worn that particular crown myself." Eleanor waited. She'd learned that silence was often more effective than questions. After a long moment, Thomas turned back to face her. "I came to Millbrook because I wanted to meet you. Not because of the curse. I don't believe in curses. I came because I wanted to meet the only other person in Wyoming, as far as I can tell, who understands what it's like to be marked by circumstance instead of character." "And what circumstance would that be?" Eleanor asked quietly. "The Redemption Ranch was built by my father and his first wife. They had 3 children, including me. My father remarried after my mother died, and within 5 years he'd lost everything. The ranch nearly failed. He went broke. He drank himself into an early grave. His second wife left him, and the town decided it was because she was cruel. But the real truth was more complicated. Sometimes people just don't survive each other. Sometimes love isn't enough to outrun bad luck." He paused. "But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what came after." Eleanor waited, tension building in her shoulders. "I inherited the Redemption Ranch at 23, penniless and broken. I married a woman named Catherine, who wanted to help me rebuild. We were happy for exactly 1 year before she died from a riding accident. No fault of mine, just bad luck and a spooked horse. The town decided I was cursed. Decided I couldn't keep a wife safe." He met Eleanor's eyes directly. "Then I married again. My second wife survived me. So did my third. They both left. Both decided they couldn't handle a man marked by death. But they left alive. That matters." Eleanor realized she was holding her breath. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I came to Millbrook to prove something. I came to prove that curses are just stories people tell themselves to make sense of randomness. That sometimes good people die for no reason. That sometimes people fail to save each other through no fault of their own. But that knowing all that, knowing the odds, knowing the grief, knowing all that, you can still choose to try again." He took a step closer, and Eleanor found herself unable to move backward. "I heard what people say about you. They heard about 4 husbands and the way Millbrook treats you like a disease. And I didn't come here to rescue you or save you or any of that fool's gold. I came here because I wanted to meet someone who understands that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just keep showing up to live your life while people judge you for things beyond your control." Eleanor's voice came out barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me, Mr. Garrett?" Thomas Garrett smiled, that sad smile again. "Honestly, I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out. I'd like to have dinner with you. I'd like to meet your daughter. I'd like to prove that it's possible for 2 people with complicated histories to sit across from each other and just be honest about how broken they are, without pretending to be whole. People will talk," Eleanor said. "Let them," Thomas replied. "They're already doing that. Might as well give them something interesting to talk about." Eleanor found herself considering this dangerous stranger who'd ridden into her carefully managed solitude and offered her something that terrified her more than anything the town had ever whispered. Behind closed doors, he was offering her choice. He was offering her the freedom to be broken with, someone who understood the weight of carrying that brokenness. He was offering her the possibility that the curse had never been real at all. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor spent the afternoon in a state of controlled panic that masqueraded as preparation. She changed her dress 3 times, each iteration feeling either too hopeful or too resigned. She settled finally on a dark blue that Catherine, her third husband's wife, the one who'd left him before Eleanor married the fool, had once complimented her on. The color made her eyes look darker, sadder, which felt honest. Sophie was in school until 4 o'clock, which gave Eleanor time to think about what she was doing. A dinner with a stranger, a man who'd arrived in town with knowledge of her name and her history, a man who claimed to understand her curse because he'd lived under one himself. She kept coming back to his eyes, that gray that had looked at her without flinching, without judgment. without that particular mixture of pity and revulsion that had become standard in Millbrook's gaze. At 3:30, Eleanor walked to Sophie's school, a small brick building at the edge of town where Miss Catherine Willows taught 12 children the basics of reading, arithmetic and how to sit still for 6 hours. Sophie emerged with her coat buttoned wrong and her hair coming loose from its pins, evidence of a day spent in her own world, which was how Eleanor preferred her daughter to be. Untouched by the weight of Eleanor's reputation for as long as possible. "Mama, can we get apples at the Mercantile? Mr. Henderson said he has fresh ones today." Sophie's voice was bright in a way Eleanor's hadn't been in years. 9 years old, and already learning that enthusiasm had to be carefully rationed. "Not today, sweetheart. We have a guest for dinner. Remember I told you?" Sophie's expression shifted immediately into something more guarded. "Is he nice? I think so. He's different from other people." Eleanor took her daughter's hand. "He owns a very large ranch. His name is Mr. Garrett." They walked together back to the Riverside Inn. Eleanor's hands were cold despite the afternoon being relatively mild. She kept telling herself this was nothing. A dinner, a conversation. Two broken people, comparing the shapes of their breaking. Thomas Garrett arrived at 6 o'clock precisely, which told Eleanor he'd planned this carefully. He'd clearly visited the local general store because he brought gifts. For Sophie, a leather-bound journal with a pencil set. For Eleanor, a collection of poems by Emily Dickinson that looked old and well-loved, its pages marked and annotated in someone's careful hand. "The journal belonged to my daughter," Thomas said when he saw Eleanor holding the poems. "She stopped writing in it when she was about your daughter's age. I thought perhaps Sophie might find it useful." Sophie stood frozen between them, journal held to her chest like a shield. She looked at Eleanor for permission before thanking him. A caution that broke Eleanor's heart, quietly. Mrs. Patterson had arranged for dinner in the private dining room of the inn. A simple meal of roasted chicken, root vegetables, fresh bread. Wine for the adults, milk for Sophie. The kind of meal that spoke of intention without shouting about it. For the first few minutes, the conversation was the careful dance of strangers attempting politeness. Thomas asked Sophie about school. Sophie answered in monosyllables. Eleanor asked Thomas about the drive from his ranch. Thomas described the landscape with a poet's attention, to detail that made the frozen prairie sound less desolate and more like the kind of beauty that only revealed itself to people who'd learned to see through winter. Then Sophie asked a question that changed everything. "Did you really have a wife who died?" Eleanor's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Sophie, it's all right," Thomas interrupted quietly. "Yes, I did. Her name was Catherine. She was riding a horse, and the horse got scared of something. Catherine fell, and she was hurt very badly, and she died the next morning." Sophie processed this with the gravity of a 9-year-old who'd grown up surrounded by death. "That wasn't your fault." "No," Thomas agreed. "It wasn't, but a lot of people thought it was. They thought maybe I'd done something wrong, or maybe I was bad luck, or maybe I was cursed, like Mama." Sophie said it as fact, not cruelty. She'd absorbed the town's narrative along with everything else. "People think Mama is cursed." Eleanor felt something tighten behind her sternum. She wanted to tell Sophie that wasn't true, that the town was wrong, that her mother wasn't a harbinger of death. But she'd taught Sophie not to lie, and the truth was complicated. Thomas set down his fork and looked directly at Sophie. "I don't think your mother is cursed. I think your mother is very unlucky in a way that has nothing to do with who she is as a person. There's a difference. A curse is something you deserve. Bad luck is just bad luck. Curses tell you something is wrong with you. Bad luck tells you something is wrong with chance." Sophie considered this with the seriousness of someone hearing philosophy for the first time. "Chance? The randomness of the world," Thomas explained. "The fact that sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason, except that the world isn't fair. Your mother didn't make those bad things happen. She was just unlucky enough to be standing next to them when they occurred." Eleanor watched her daughter absorb this. Watched something shift in her shoulders, some small weight lifting. "So you don't think she's bad?" Sophie asked. "I think she's one of the bravest people I've ever met." Thomas said simply. Because she lost people she loved, and the town blamed her for it, and she's still here. She's still trying to be a good person, even though everyone believes the worst of her. That's not cursed. That's courageous. Sophie nodded slowly and returned to her chicken, but something had changed in the room. Eleanor felt tears prick the back of her eyes and fought to keep her breathing steady. After dinner, Sophie was sent upstairs to Mrs. Patterson's private quarters to read her new journal, while Eleanor and Thomas took coffee in the small drawing room. The fire had burned down to embers, casting everything in shadow and half-light. "That was cruel of me," Eleanor said quietly, allowing Sophie to hear that. "She already carries enough of this burden." "No," Thomas set down his cup. "Sophie was already carrying the burden. You just gave her a different way to think about it. You gave her permission to stop believing her mother is the source of everything bad that's happened in her life. She's 9 years old. She shouldn't have to think about any of this. She's 9 years old, and she's already absorbed the town's cruelty. The only question is whether she continues to believe the narrative they're selling, or whether she gets to decide her own truth." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "I had the same moment at her age. My father told me that sometimes people died around him, and that meant he was cursed. I believed him for years. Then I realized he was just a sad man who'd learned to transfer his sadness into something that felt more like power. Curses are things we tell ourselves to make sense of things we don't understand." Eleanor looked at him, across the small distance between them. "Do you really believe that? Or are you just trying to make me feel better?" "Both. I believe it because it's true, and I'm telling you because I want you to feel better." He didn't look away. "I've spent the last 15 years running this ranch alone, because it was easier than risking that anyone else would die in my sphere of influence. I've watched opportunities for companionship pass, because I convinced myself I was saving people from the curse of knowing me. And then I heard about you, and I realized that I've been letting the town's story about me dictate my entire life." "What changed?" "I decided that I was tired of living in the past, that staying alone wasn't protecting anyone. It was just another kind of death, a slower one." Eleanor felt something catch in her chest. This was dangerous territory. This was the moment where she needed to retreat, to establish boundaries, to remember the careful distance she'd built between herself and the world. Instead, she heard herself ask, "What happens if we allow ourselves to hope and the universe punishes us for it? What if the curse is real and this is just the calm before the breaking?" Thomas reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was calloused, worked, honest. "Then at least we'll have had this moment together. At least for however long we get, we'll know we tried." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. She thought about Marcus in his ravine, about Thomas on the train tracks, about Charles burning with fever in Chicago. She thought about the way the town had looked at her after each death, cataloguing her as dangerous. "People will talk," she said finally. "If you keep coming here, if we keep being seen together, the town will destroy you the way they've tried to destroy me. Let them." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "I'm not asking you for something easy, Eleanor. I'm asking you for something honest. I'm asking you to let me know you, not the cautious version you show the world, but the real version underneath. The one who's angry sometimes, who's scared sometimes, who's tired of being treated like a walking curse." Eleanor wanted to pull away. She wanted to tell him it was impossible, that she was impossible, that anything between them would only end in another grave and another town full of whispers. But underneath all that, there was something else. Something that had been buried for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. Hope, not the fragile, desperate hope of a woman clinging to straw, but the solid, grounded hope of someone recognizing themselves in another person's eyes and realizing they weren't as alone as they'd believed. "If you're going to do this," Eleanor said carefully, "you should know what you're walking into. There are documents, records of all 4 husbands, of how they died. The town has made sure I keep those stories alive, whether I want to or not." "I want to know," Thomas said. "Not the town's version, Your version. What you remember about each of them. Who they were when nobody was looking. I want to know the entire weight of what you're carrying, Eleanor. Not to save you from it, but to help you carry it if I can. Eleanor closed her eyes and felt something shift in the architecture of her grief. For 5 years, she'd held this weight alone, convinced that her burden was hers to bear in isolation. It had never occurred to her that someone might ask to share it. Tomorrow, she said quietly. Tomorrow I'll tell you about Marcus. The first one. The one who started all of this. Thomas nodded, as if she'd given him something infinitely precious, which perhaps she had. Permission. Trust. The smallest crack in the wall she'd built around herself. When he left an hour later, Eleanor walked him to the door. He didn't try to kiss her or take improper liberties. He simply pressed her hand once and said he'd return tomorrow at the same time. Upstairs, she found Sophie already asleep, the new journal on the bedside table with the pencil set nearby. Eleanor picked up the journal and looked at the front cover, where Sophie had already written in careful letters, "Things that are true about me." She set it down gently and sat on the edge of her daughter's bed. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to wake up and not be afraid that today would be the day the next husband died, the next tragedy struck, the next piece of her soul broke irreparably. It was a dangerous kind of hope. It was the most dangerous thing she'd ever felt. Winter loosened its grip on Millbrook slowly, reluctantly, leaving patches of snow in the shadowed places long after the roads had dried. Eleanor found herself falling into a rhythm she hadn't expected, a rhythm that involved Thomas visiting twice a week, sometimes with gifts, books, ribbon for Sophie's hair, a jar of honey from a supplier he knew, but more often simply with his presence. He didn't press. He didn't demand access to her time or her body or her future. He simply existed in her life, like someone learning a new language, careful with his words, attentive to her silences. When she pulled away, he didn't follow. When she moved closer, he didn't take advantage. It was the slowest courtship Millbrook had ever witnessed, and precisely because of its restraint, it became the most scandalous. The ladies' auxiliary began organizing around Eleanor with the efficiency of an invading army. Meetings were held in drawing rooms where Eleanor wasn't present, but where people she knew would carry information back to her. Concerns were raised about whether she should continue teaching at the schoolhouse. Questions were posed about whether her presence was appropriate, given her history. One woman, Martha Henderson, whose own marriage was barely surviving and who seemed to take grim pleasure in Eleanor's suffering, began a petition suggesting that Eleanor was a moral hazard to the young girls under her instruction. Eleanor learned about the petition from Mrs. Patterson, who brought her the news with something like apology in her expression. "They have 12 signatures," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, as Eleanor sat in the inn's small parlor, folding napkins with mechanical precision. But the schoolmaster refused to accept it. He said he'd reviewed Eleanor's teaching records and found nothing but excellence. He said that morality is measured by actions, not by circumstance, and that Eleanor's actions have been consistently exemplary. Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, not quite gratitude, but recognition. She had allies. They were outnumbered, but they existed. Sophie came home from school that day with a new kind of quietness, the kind that came from processing information too heavy for a 9-year-old to carry. "Are they making you leave?" Sophie asked, without preamble, standing in the doorway of their small boarding room. Eleanor set down the mending she'd been working on. "Not yet. The schoolmaster defended me. But they want to," Sophie said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." Sophie moved to the window and stood there with her small hands pressed against the glass, looking down at the street below. "Mr. Garrett asked if I wanted to ride horses at his ranch. He said there's a small pony that's very gentle, and that he thought I might like to learn." Eleanor's breath caught. "What did you tell him?" "I said I'd think about it." Sophie turned to face her mother. "Is he trying to buy my approval?" Eleanor almost smiled at the bluntness of the question. "Do you think he is?" "I think he's trying to prove something." Sophie replied carefully. I'm not sure what yet. But I think he's been patient about it, which is more than most people are with me. 2 weeks later, Eleanor found herself at the Redemption Ranch on a Saturday afternoon, watching Sophie mount a small, dappled pony with Thomas's patient guidance. The child was terrified and trying desperately not to show it, her small body rigid in the saddle despite Thomas's calm encouragement. "There's no rush," Thomas said, holding the pony's bridle steady. "We can just walk in circles today. There's no test, no finish line. Just you and the horse getting to know each other." Eleanor watched her daughter relax almost imperceptibly at those words. No test, no finish line. Just existence, without judgment. They spent the afternoon at the ranch, and Thomas showed Eleanor the improvements he'd made since she'd last visited. A new barn was under construction. An irrigation system had been installed in one of the pastures. He was building something, Eleanor realized. He was building infrastructure, permanence, a foundation. "I'm expanding the operation," he explained as they stood looking out at his land. "Planning to increase the herd, invest in better breeding stock. It's going to take years, but I'm thinking long-term now." "Why?" Eleanor asked. "You seemed content with the size of the ranch before." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Because I realized I was living like someone just passing through. Everything I did was temporary, efficient, minimal. I wasn't building for a future, I was just maintaining the present." He turned to face her. "But lately, I've started thinking about what a future might look like. What it might mean to build something that could last." Eleanor understood. He wasn't just talking about the ranch. That evening, Eleanor received a letter. It was written in an unfamiliar hand on expensive paper, and it came from Eleanor's sister in Omaha, Margaret, who she hadn't heard from in 3 years. The letter began with apologies for the silence. Margaret explained that she'd been ashamed of the way their family had treated Eleanor after Marcus's death, ashamed of the distance she'd allowed to grow, ashamed of her own cowardice in not reaching out sooner. But the letter also contained information. Margaret had done something that Eleanor hadn't known was being done. She'd been in contact with a physician who specialized in understanding the conditions of inheritance and biology. Margaret had discovered that their mother's sister had also been unable to bear children. Their grandmother had suffered the same inability. It was something that ran in their bloodline, something biological and ordinary, and completely unrelated to any choices Eleanor had made, or any curse she supposedly carried. "You were never broken," Margaret wrote in her careful script. "You were never cursed. You were simply a woman with a condition that society has decided is shameful. But Mother and I, we should have protected you from that shame instead of adding to it. I can only ask your forgiveness now, belatedly, and tell you that I'm proud of who you've become despite our family's failure to stand beside you." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. Sophie found her sitting on the edge of the bed, the letter still in her lap. "What is it?" Sophie asked, climbing up beside her mother. Eleanor showed her the letter without explanation. Sophie read slowly, moving her lips as she worked through the longer words. And when she finished, she looked at her mother with something like anger in her eyes. "So the whole town has been cruel to you for no reason at all," Sophie said flatly. "They just decided you were cursed, and nobody bothered to find out the truth. People are afraid of things they don't understand," Eleanor offered. Though even to her own ears, it sounded like she was making excuses for the inexcusable. "That's stupid," Sophie said with the blunt wisdom of childhood. "If they don't understand something, they should ask. They shouldn't just decide someone is a curse." Eleanor held her daughter close, and they sat together in the gathering darkness. 2 broken people who were slowly learning that perhaps their breaks had never been their fault. The following Sunday, Thomas came to Millbrook for services at the church. It was a calculated move. He'd never attended before. He sat in the back pew, and Eleanor felt the weight of the town's attention shift and focus like a spotlight finding a new target. The sermon that day was about judgment. The preacher spoke about how God was the only true judge, how humans were prone to creating false narratives about people based on fear and misunderstanding. Eleanor wondered if he was making a point, if somehow word of the petition had reached him. After the service, people filtered out slowly, and Thomas stood and waited for Eleanor and Sophie in the aisle. He offered Eleanor his arm with the formality of a man making a deliberate statement. Eleanor took it, feeling every eye in the church turn toward them. Outside, Martha Henderson stood on the church steps with her husband, and she called out loudly enough for a dozen people to hear, "Mr. Garrett, I do hope you know what you're getting into. Mrs. Eleanor has quite a history with husbands. It would be a tragedy if you became her next casualty." The crowd went absolutely silent. This was too direct, too cruel, even for Millbrook's usual brand of social judgment. Thomas stopped walking. He turned to face Martha with a calmness that was somehow more intimidating than anger. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice carrying across the silent street, "I know exactly what I'm getting into. I'm getting into a relationship with a woman of extraordinary character and strength. I'm getting into a situation where I have the honor of earning the trust of a remarkable child. And I'm getting into a community that has apparently decided that cruelty is an acceptable substitute for compassion." He paused. What happened to Eleanor's previous husbands was tragedy, not curse. What's happening to Eleanor now is persecution, not protection. And if this community continues to treat her as though she's responsible for deaths beyond her control, then I'd suggest you examine whether you're actually practicing the Christianity you claim to believe in. He turned back to Eleanor and Sophie. "Shall we?" They walked through the crowd together, and Eleanor felt something shift in the atmosphere. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of doubt in the narrative the town had constructed. That evening, Thomas came to the boarding house. He asked Mrs. Patterson if he could speak with Eleanor privately, and she ushered them into the small sitting room with discretion and a knowing smile. "I'm going to ask you something," Thomas began without preamble, "and I want you to answer as honestly as you can. Not with the version of honesty you think I need to hear." Eleanor nodded, her heart rate increasing. "Do you love me?" The question was so direct, so free of artifice, that Eleanor found herself answering truthfully, despite all her defenses. "I'm terrified of loving you," she said quietly. "I'm terrified that the pattern will repeat, that some tragedy will take you from me, that the town will decide I'm responsible, that I'll have to bury another husband and live through another cycle of blame and grief." "I know," Thomas replied, "but that's not what I asked. Do you love me?" Eleanor met his eyes. "Yes." "Then I'm going to ask you something else," Thomas continued. "I'm going to ask you to marry me, not because I believe that will protect us from tragedy. I don't. Tragedy is random and unpredictable. But because I believe that whatever comes, we'll face it better together than we will separately." He pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, not elaborate, not expensive, but genuinely beautiful. Simple gold with a small sapphire the color of winter sky. "This was my mother's ring," Thomas explained. "She believed that marriage was about two people choosing to stand beside each other, despite fear, despite odds, despite everything the world throws at them. I think she'd like knowing that this ring represents that choice again." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. "I'm not asking you to stop being afraid," Thomas said. "I'm asking you to be afraid with me. I'm asking you to choose me anyway, knowing that we might fail, knowing that the town might judge us, knowing that life is fundamentally uncertain." "And Sophie?" Eleanor asked. "Sophie is part of the package," Thomas replied. "I want to adopt her if you'll allow it. I want her to have my name, to have the legal protection of being my daughter. I want her to know that there are men in this world who show up, who stay, who don't abandon people they love." Eleanor didn't remember saying yes, but she must have, because Thomas was sliding the ring onto her finger, and Sophie was being called into the room and was being told that she was going to have a father, and Eleanor was being held by the first man in a very long time, who wasn't running away or dying or disappearing. He was simply staying. News of the engagement spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and the town's response was as divided as Eleanor had anticipated. Some people, the ones with any capacity for reflection, seemed to accept that perhaps they'd been wrong about Eleanor all along. The schoolmaster invited her to continue teaching indefinitely. Several women who'd previously avoided her began stopping by the boarding house with awkward congratulations and questions about wedding plans, but others doubled down. The anger of having their narrative disrupted manifested in uglier ways. Eleanor began finding notes slipped under her door. Anonymous, of course, because cruelty required darkness to survive. They called her a predator. They warned that Thomas was being trapped by a woman with a talent for making men disappear. They suggested that perhaps Eleanor had murdered her previous husbands had there been investigations. How did anyone know for certain what had really happened? Sophie came home from school with a black eye one Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor's entire world stopped. "What happened?" she demanded, moving to examine her daughter's face gently. "Checking for more injuries. Tommy Ashford said that Mr. Garrett was foolish and that you were a witch," Sophie reported, her small voice hard with anger. "I told him to stop talking about you that way. He hit me. I hit him back harder." Eleanor felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. She'd spent years absorbing the town's judgment without retaliation, had learned to make herself smaller, to accept cruelty as the price of existing. But watching her daughter absorb that same treatment, watching Sophie's natural spirit being worn down by the same social machinery that had damaged Eleanor, that activated something different entirely. "Come with me," Eleanor said. She marched Sophie down to the schoolhouse and demanded to speak with the schoolmaster. She brought Sophie into his office and showed him the black eye and explained what had happened. The schoolmaster, a man named Frederick Walsh, who was perhaps 10 years younger than Eleanor, and who had been nothing but professional and kind since hiring her, listened carefully and nodded. "Tommy Ashford has been difficult all year," Walsh said. "His father has been particularly vocal about the situation with you and Mr. Garrett. I suspect young Tommy is parroting his father's sentiments." "I want him expelled," Eleanor said, shocking herself with the firmness in her voice. "If this school is going to employ me and accept my daughter as a student, then it needs to maintain standards of basic decency. Physical violence toward another student, particularly motivated by prejudice toward her family, is not acceptable." Walsh blinked. "Mrs. Eleanor, I'm not asking," Eleanor continued, feeling something hard and clear settling into her spine. "Either the boy is expelled or I resign, effective immediately. And when parents ask why, I'll make sure they know exactly what happened and why standards of conduct matter." It was a gamble. Eleanor was aware that she was leveraging her position, that she was becoming a problem rather than remaining quietly compliant. But she'd also reached a limit, one she hadn't even known existed until it was breached by a fist aimed at her daughter. Walsh studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and there was something like respect in that smile. "I'll speak with the boy's father today," Walsh said. "And if he refuses to ensure proper conduct, then yes, the boy will be expelled. Standards of conduct matter. You're absolutely right." Eleanor brought Sophie to the Redemption Ranch after school. She needed to tell Thomas what had happened, and she also needed to remove Sophie from town for a while, to give her space away from the perpetual judgment. Thomas listened to her account of the incident with increasing anger, but his anger wasn't directed at Eleanor. It was directed at the system that created Tommy Ashford's, at the parents who passed their prejudices down to their children like hereditary disease. "I want to pull her out of school," Eleanor said. "I want to teach her here at the ranch. I can do it. I was trained to teach, and I can certainly manage Sophie's education myself." Thomas considered this. "Is that what Sophie wants?" Eleanor realized she hadn't asked. She'd assumed, made decisions, moved forward with the momentum of her own protective fury. It was a mirror of how the town had treated her, deciding what was best without asking what was actually desired. Sophie was in the ranch kitchen with Thomas's housekeeper, Mrs. Violet, who'd worked at the Redemption Ranch for 15 years and who had received Eleanor with quiet warmth. Sophie was learning to make biscuits, her small hands working dough under Mrs. Violet's patient guidance. "Sophie," Eleanor called, "I want to ask you something." Sophie looked up, flour on her nose and in her dark hair. "Would you want to study here at the ranch instead of at school? I could teach you. We could work at your own pace." Sophie set down the dough. "Would I still see my friends?" Eleanor's protective instinct wanted to answer no, to isolate Sophie completely from the sources of harm. But that would be repeating the cycle, using protection as a cage. "Yes," Eleanor said. "But they wouldn't be at school. We'd need to arrange visits separately." Sophie considered this seriously. "Well, what about the other students who are nice?" "Lucy Parker is nice. She shares her lunch with me sometimes." "You'd lose access to them if you weren't at school," Eleanor acknowledged. Sophie wiped her hands on her apron. "I want to stay at school," she said finally. "But not with Tommy Ashford if he's going to be mean. And not if it's going to make it hard for you to work there." The wisdom in that statement, the ability to weigh her own comfort against her mother's, struck Eleanor as both heartbreaking and beautiful. "I'm going to speak with the schoolmaster," Eleanor told her daughter, "and I'm going to make it clear that Tommy Ashford's behavior isn't acceptable. If he stays, then we'll deal with that. But I won't just accept it." That evening, Thomas rode into town with Eleanor. He went to speak with Jonathan Ashford, Tommy's father, while Eleanor remained at the boarding house. She didn't know what Thomas said exactly, but the following morning, she heard that Tommy Ashford had been sent to stay with relatives in Denver for the remainder of the school year for his own benefit. And the benefit of his family, it was an exile, dressed up as opportunity, but it accomplished the goal. Over the following weeks, preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Eleanor had married 3 times before, and each wedding had been performed with varying degrees of ceremony. Marcus's had been small and quiet. Eleanor's family had seemed almost apologetic about her happiness. Thomas Brennan's had been more elaborate, a celebration cut short by Eleanor's knowledge that his family disapproved of her. Charlie's had been conducted with the efficiency of someone simply completing a transaction. This time was different. Mrs. Patterson offered to host the wedding at the inn's garden, which would be in full bloom by late spring. The schoolmaster and his wife offered to help coordinate. Several women who'd previously been hostile began stopping by with genuine offers of assistance. Eleanor realized slowly that her willingness to defend Sophie, to set boundaries, to stop absorbing judgment without question, had changed how people perceived her. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer helpless. She was a woman making choices and accepting consequences. And apparently that was more respectable to the town than suffering gracefully. Sophie became invested in the wedding planning with an intensity that surprised Eleanor. She selected colors, soft greens and cream. She insisted on having a role in the ceremony itself. She wanted to wear a special dress that she'd chosen with Mrs. Violet. "I want people to know I'm part of this," Sophie explained when Eleanor asked why she cared so much. "I want them to know that this isn't just about you getting married. It's about us becoming a family. It's about me choosing Mr. Garrett as much as you are." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. Somewhere in the months since Thomas had first walked into the Riverside Inn and offered Eleanor the possibility of being seen, Sophie had moved from cautious to committed. She decided to trust, to believe that this time might be different. 2 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor received another letter from her sister Margaret. This one was shorter, more practical. Margaret was coming to Millbrook for the wedding. She was bringing her husband and her 2 children. She was coming, she wrote, to stand beside Eleanor and to finally, after years of silence and shame, be part of her sister's life in a meaningful way. Eleanor cried when she read this letter, but they were a different kind of tears than the ones that had come before. These were tears of repair, of something broken beginning to mend. The night before the wedding, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house one last night before she moved permanently to the Redemption Ranch and became Mrs. Thomas Garrett, and thought about everything that had brought her here. 4 dead husbands, a town full of judgment, years of carrying shame that wasn't hers to carry, a daughter learning to survive in a hostile world. And then, impossibly, a man who'd walked in and asked her a simple question: "Do you believe in curses?" She didn't, not anymore. Thomas had shown her that curses were just stories people told to make sense of randomness, that sometimes good people died for reasons beyond anyone's control, that sometimes women were blamed for circumstances that had nothing to do with them, that the real curse wasn't in Eleanor's life, it was in a society that had decided she was responsible for tragedy. There was a soft knock on her door. Eleanor opened it to find Sophie, still half asleep, holding her wooden doll, a toy Eleanor had given her years ago when Sophie was barely walking. "I'm nervous," Sophie admitted. Eleanor pulled her daughter into the narrow bed and held her close. "Me too. What if something bad happens?" Sophie asked, the question revealing the depth of fear the child had been carrying. "Then we'll handle it together," Eleanor replied. "The 3 of us. That's what families do. They face things together." Sophie settled against her mother's chest, and they lay together in the dark. 2 people who'd learned the hard way that love required courage. That trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt deliberately, carefully, with full awareness of the risk. But it could be rebuilt. That was the real lesson Eleanor had learned. Not that the curse was fake, though it was. Not that the town was wrong, though it had been. But that even after everything had fallen apart, even after multiple failures, even after carrying shame that wasn't hers, it was still possible to choose love, to choose trust, to choose to stand beside someone despite fear. In the morning, she would become a wife again, but this time it would be different. This time, she was choosing it with full knowledge of the risks. This time, she was doing it not because she was supposed to, but because she wanted to. This time, she was doing it free. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, the kind of May morning that felt like a blessing from the sky itself. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the boarding house windows and the sound of activity below. Mrs. Patterson and her helpers preparing the garden, arranging flowers, setting up chairs, creating a space that had been transformed overnight into something hopeful. Margaret was already awake when Eleanor entered the common area. Her sister looked different than Eleanor remembered. Older, yes, but also softer. The sharp edges of their mother's expectations seemed to have worn away from Margaret's face, replaced by something warmer. "You look terrified," Margaret observed, embracing Eleanor carefully so as not to disturb her appearance. "I am," Eleanor admitted. "Not about Thomas. About everything else. About what comes next. About whether I'm allowed to be happy or if there's still a debt to pay." Margaret pulled back and held Eleanor at arm's length. "You paid every debt the town demanded and then some. You apologized for things that weren't your fault. You absorbed judgment that belonged to other people. If anyone owes anyone, it's not you who owes." She smiled. "And for what it's worth, I think our mother would be shocked to see you now. Not shocked in a disapproving way, shocked that you managed to become this remarkable woman despite how we treated you." Eleanor's dress was simple but elegant, cream linen with delicate lacework that Mrs. Patterson's cousin had stitched over the course of several weeks. It wasn't elaborate or showy, but it was beautiful, and more importantly, Eleanor had chosen it. Every detail of the wedding reflected her own preferences rather than expectations or tradition. Sophie appeared in the doorway dressed in a soft green dress that made her look older and younger simultaneously. She'd been so excited about the wedding that she'd barely slept the night before, and that excitement had carried through to this morning. She looked, Eleanor thought, like a child who'd been given permission to hope. "Are you nervous, Mother?" Sophie asked, using the formal version of the address she typically reserved for moments of particular seriousness. "Terrified," Eleanor confirmed, but in a good way. The kind of fear that comes with wanting something very much and being afraid you might lose it. Sophie took her hand. "You won't lose it. Mr. Garrett came all the way here to find you. He's not going to leave now. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. By 1:30, the garden was filled with people. The schoolmaster and his wife occupied a front row seat. Several ranchers from the surrounding properties had come, men who worked alongside Thomas and who seemed to regard him with genuine respect. Mrs. Violet, Thomas's housekeeper, sat with tears already streaming down her face before anything had even begun. But it was the other guests that struck Eleanor most forcefully. Women who'd previously been hostile had come. Mrs. Henderson had sent regrets due to a sudden illness, but Eleanor took that as a gift. The woman's absence was a form of respect for Eleanor's decision to exclude her. Other women, though, had come genuinely. Some brought gifts, some simply came to bear witness. The schoolmaster stood to conduct the ceremony. It wasn't traditional. Most of Millbrook would have expected the preacher to preside, but Thomas had asked him specifically, saying that Walsh had shown Eleanor more kindness than any man of the cloth, and that seemed to matter more than official titles. Eleanor walked through the garden on Margaret's arm, Sophie walking beside them, scattering flower petals with the precision of someone taking a solemn responsibility. At the makeshift altar made of white cloth and flowers, Thomas stood waiting. He wore a suit that fit him well, and his dark eyes tracked Eleanor's movement with an intensity that made everything else fade away. When Eleanor reached him and he took her hand, she felt the tremor in his fingers. He was as nervous as she was. "We are gathered here," the schoolmaster began, "not to witness the continuation of a tradition, but to witness a choice. Eleanor and Thomas have chosen each other despite fear, despite judgment, despite everything that would ordinarily convince two rational people to protect themselves instead." He looked out at the assembled guests. "That's what marriage is at its core. Not obligation, not propriety, not social expectation. Marriage is two people deciding that they would rather face an uncertain future together than face it alone." The ceremony was short. Eleanor and Thomas had written their own vows. A radical departure from tradition that should have scandalized Millbrook, but somehow seemed fitting given everything they'd already challenged. Thomas spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Eleanor, I came to Millbrook to prove that curses were just stories people tell themselves. But what I found was something more important. I found a woman who'd been carrying the weight of other people's stories instead of living her own. I want to spend the rest of my life helping you write your own story. I want to be the man who shows up, who stays, who chooses you every single day, despite fear. I want to build a life with you and Sophie that proves love is stronger than judgment, that choice matters more than circumstance, that sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is simply let ourselves be loved." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. But they were the right kind of tears, tears of release, of acceptance, of finally allowing herself to believe in a future. Eleanor's vows came out shaky but clear. "Thomas, I've spent years believing that I was responsible for things beyond my control. I've spent years absorbing blame that wasn't mine and shame that I didn't deserve. You've shown me that I have the right to choose my own story. You've shown me that it's possible to love someone without being destroyed by that love. You've shown Sophie and me that there are good people in this world who keep their promises. I choose you. I choose us. I choose to believe that this time we get to be happy." When the schoolmaster pronounced them married and Thomas kissed Eleanor, the garden erupted in applause. It was genuine applause. Eleanor could hear it in the quality of the sound, could see it in the faces of the people around her. Some people would never accept her, would carry their prejudices into their graves. But others had allowed themselves to be convinced that maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong about Eleanor Hartwell all along. The reception that followed was held at the Redemption Ranch. Thomas had invited everyone to come, and to Eleanor's surprise, most people did. The schoolmaster and his wife helped coordinate a meal. Several women brought dishes. It was the most integrated Millbrook had ever been. The same social divisions that usually separated people erased, if only temporarily, by the presence of genuine joy. Margaret's children played with Sophie. their initial shyness melting away quickly. Margaret herself seemed to come alive in the company of other women, storytelling and laughing in a way that made Eleanor realize how isolated her sister had been in her own life. Their mother's church ladies, it seemed, were just as judgmental as Millbrook's gossip mill. As the evening deepened, Eleanor found herself standing apart from the celebration, looking out at the land that was now hers, the Redemption Ranch, this place that Thomas had built and was now offering to share. Mrs. Violet approached with a knowing smile. "He's nervous about the wedding night," Mrs. Violet said without preamble. "He's been nervous all week. I've never seen him this anxious, not even when he was in the midst of everything falling apart years ago." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Is he?" "He cares about you," Mrs. Violet said. "Really cares. It matters to him that you're truly choosing this. He doesn't want you to feel obligated." Eleanor found Thomas near the corral, looking out at his horses with the expression of someone needing grounding. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Mrs. Garrett," he said, and there was something wonderfully intimate about the title coming from his mouth. "How is the bride feeling?" "Like I should clarify something," Eleanor replied. She reached up and touched his face. "I know you're nervous about tonight, Mrs. Violet told me." Thomas looked embarrassed. "I didn't want to presume." Eleanor cut him off with a kiss. When they broke apart, she was smiling. "I'm nervous too. But I'm nervous in the same way I was before our first dinner. Nervous because I care about this mattering. Nervous because I want this to be real." She took his hand. "I've been married before. I understand what happens between a husband and wife in private. But I've never been married to someone I actually chose. I've never been married to someone who chose me back, fully and completely, knowing all my complications." Thomas pulled her close. "Then shall we find out what that feels like?" Later, in the master bedroom of the Redemption Ranch, a room Eleanor would now share with Thomas, a permanence that still felt slightly unreal, Eleanor found herself falling into intimacy with a man who approached her body like he was discovering something precious rather than claiming something. He moved slowly, asking permission at each step forward. He seemed genuinely interested in her pleasure, in her comfort, in the experience being something they created together rather than something done to her. It was different from her previous experiences, less like fulfilling an obligation and more like genuine connection. Afterward, lying beside him in the darkness, Eleanor felt something settle in her chest. "This," she thought. "This is what it feels like to be safe. Are you all right?" Thomas asked softly. "I'm more than all right," Eleanor replied. "I'm happy. Actually genuinely happy." "I'm not sure I know how to be this," Thomas laughed, a sound of pure relief. "I know exactly what you mean. I was terrified you'd wake up this morning and realize you'd made a terrible mistake." "I did wake up thinking that," Eleanor admitted, "but only for about 30 seconds. Then I remembered that you're real, that this is real, and that I finally get to keep something." Thomas pulled her closer, and they lay together in the darkness, two people who'd both thought their chances at happiness were behind them, discovering that sometimes the best things arrive when you've stopped looking for them. When you've already made peace with loss, when you're finally brave enough to choose despite fear. In the morning, Eleanor would wake in this bed and begin the process of moving her belongings from the boarding house. She would become the permanent resident of the Redemption Ranch, would take on the role of Thomas's wife, would build a life that looked nothing like what society had expected of her. Sophie would have a real home for the first time in her life, not just a room in a boarding house, but a genuine space that was hers, with a father who'd chosen her, with a mother who'd finally stopped being haunted by her past failures, and Millbrook, that small Wyoming town that had decided Eleanor Hartwell was cursed, would eventually learn a different story. They would see her thriving. They would see Sophie flourish under the care of a man who wasn't running away. They would see the Redemption Ranch prosper and grow. And slowly, over time, the narrative would shift. She wouldn't be the cursed widow anymore. She would be Eleanor Garrett, the woman who'd proven that sometimes the best way to break a curse is to simply refuse to believe in it. But that was all still to come. For tonight, in the darkness of the Redemption Ranch, Eleanor simply allowed herself to exist in the moment, held by a man who loved her, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges and its own uncertainties, but knowing also that she wouldn't face them alone. That was enough. That was everything. The first 3 months of Eleanor's marriage to Thomas were deceptively peaceful. She'd settled into the Redemption Ranch with an ease that surprised her, as if some part of her had always known she belonged there. Sophie had claimed a room on the 2nd floor and had begun filling it with books and pressed flowers and small treasures that represented her growing sense of security. The ranch operations had expanded. Under Thomas's careful management, he'd purchased additional breeding stock, and the herd was growing. The hay crops had been excellent. Everything seemed to be moving in the direction of genuine prosperity. Then came the letter from the territorial attorney's office. It arrived on a Monday morning in late August, delivered by an official-looking man who rode out from town and handed it directly to Thomas with an expression of professional neutrality. Thomas read it, his face going very still and without a word. He handed it to Eleanor. The letter was formal and complicated, but the essential information was clear. Marcus Holloway's family had reopened an investigation into his death. They were questioning whether his death, which had been ruled accidental nearly 15 years prior, might have been something else. They were requesting that Eleanor submit to questioning regarding the circumstances of her first husband's death. They were suggesting that perhaps his death hadn't been accidental after all. Eleanor read the letter twice, feeling something cold and ancient rise in her chest. The curse, she thought irrationally. It's not over. It's never over, don't, Thomas said quietly, and Eleanor realized he'd been watching her face. Don't go there. How can I not? Eleanor's voice came out thin and strained. They're accusing me of murder, Thomas. The Holloway family has decided that the story of my curse isn't metaphorical. They've decided I literally killed Marcus. Thomas set down the letter. We're going to show you they're wrong. How? Eleanor asked desperately. Marcus is dead. The original investigation is closed. His family is powerful. They have money and influence. I'm a woman with a reputation for being cursed. In a court of law, who do you think people will believe? Thomas crossed to her and took her hands in his. I believe you. Sophie believes you. The schoolmaster believes you. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Violet, the community we've built here, they all believe you. That matters. It doesn't matter if it doesn't hold up in court, Eleanor replied, but Thomas was already moving, already thinking ahead. He sent letters to people who'd been present when Marcus died. He contacted newspapers that had covered the original investigation. He hired a lawyer from Cheyenne, a woman named Catherine Pierce, who specialized in defending women against character assassination and had a reputation for being both brilliant and relentless. When Catherine arrived at the Redemption Ranch a week later, she was not what Eleanor expected. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that assessed everything with clinical precision. She wore a suit that would have been considered scandalous in Millbrook, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd stopped caring about other people's expectations years ago. Tell me everything, Catherine said without preamble, settling into a chair in the rancher's study. And I mean everything. Don't omit details because they embarrass you or because you think they make you look bad. I need to know the complete truth so that I can anticipate what the Holloway family's lawyers will try to use against you. Eleanor spent hours recounting her marriage to Marcus. She described his moods, his gambling debts, his increasing recklessness. She admitted that their marriage had been unhappy, that she'd been considering leaving him, that she'd felt something close to relief when he died. Good, Catherine said, making notes. That honesty is going to save you. If you'd told me you were heartbroken and devoted, I'd worry they'd argue you had motive to lie. But relief? That's human. That's understandable. That's the kind of emotion that makes you credible. She set down her pen. Here's what I need to understand. Do you have any actual evidence of what happened that day? Any witnesses who can confirm Marcus's state of mind? Any documentation of his financial troubles? Eleanor thought. His creditors sent letters. I kept some of them. They're in storage in Omaha, and there were people at the stable where he kept his horse. They said he'd been drinking. They said he was reckless with the horse. Names? Catherine pressed. I don't remember all of them. It was so long ago, and I was grieving. We'll find them, Catherine said with certainty. The stable owner, the staff, someone will remember. And we'll establish that Marcus Holloway was a man who engaged in risky behavior, who had financial troubles driving him to desperation, and who may very well have driven his horse into that ravine because he was drunk and reckless, not because anyone poisoned him or pushed him or whatever else the Holloway family is suggesting. Over the next 2 months, Catherine built a defense with meticulous precision. She located the stable owner, now retired but still living in Omaha, who confirmed that Marcus had been a regular drinker with poor judgment. She found creditors willing to testify about his debts. She discovered court records showing that the Holloway family had attempted to challenge the ruling once before, 12 years ago, and had been rejected by the judge at that time. They're doing this because they need someone to blame, Catherine explained during one of her visits to the ranch. The family business is struggling. They've lost money to bad investments. They need a scandal to distract from their own failures. And you, a woman with a reputation for being cursed, you're the perfect target. But Eleanor wasn't reassured. The accusations were spreading. People who'd accepted Eleanor's presence at the ranch suddenly seemed uncertain again. The schoolmaster came to tell her quietly that some parents were asking whether Sophie should be allowed to continue at the school. Mrs. Patterson, delivering supplies to the ranch, mentioned that the town was divided on whether Eleanor should be banned from the general store. The curse, it seemed, was resurrecting itself. Sophie came home from school one afternoon and announced that she was going to stop attending. If they don't want me there, then I won't go, she said, with the stubbornness Eleanor recognized as her own. We're not going to let them dictate your education, Thomas said firmly. But Eleanor, I think we need to talk about this. We need to figure out what we're actually facing and what we're willing to fight. That night, Eleanor, Thomas, and Catherine gathered in the study. The trial will be in the territorial court, Catherine explained. Judge Adelaide Morrison will preside. She's fair but conservative. She'll base her decision on evidence, not emotion. And here's the good news. The evidence strongly suggests that Marcus Holloway died as a result of his own recklessness, not because of anything Eleanor did. Then why do I feel like we're going to lose? Eleanor asked. Because you've internalized the town's narrative, Catherine replied bluntly. You've spent so long believing you're cursed that you're having trouble believing the truth, which is that you're not. The Holloway family is grasping at straws. Their case is weak. Their motivation is transparent. And you have character witnesses now. You're not the isolated woman you were 15 years ago. Catherine leaned forward. Eleanor, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you believe you had anything to do with Marcus's death? No, Eleanor replied immediately. I know I didn't. Then we're going to prove it, Catherine said. And we're going to make the Holloway family understand that manufacturing scandals isn't going to change history. The trial was held in Helena in October. Eleanor, Thomas, and Catherine traveled together, staying in a small hotel near the courthouse. The night before the trial began, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She paced the small hotel room, while Thomas watched her with patient understanding. What if they convince the judge? Eleanor asked for what was probably the 100th time. What if I'm convicted of something I didn't do? What if Sophie loses both her mother and her mother's reputation? Then we'll appeal, Thomas said quietly. And we'll fight again. But Eleanor, listen to me. That's not going to happen. The evidence is clear. The trial began with the prosecution's case. They presented the Holloway family's narrative. Eleanor had wanted to leave Marcus, and he'd refused. Eleanor had supposedly been having an affair with a stable hand. Eleanor had allegedly given Marcus something to make him reckless, something to make him likely to take unnecessary risks. It was all speculation, no evidence. But it was also the kind of story that people wanted to believe because it explained tragedy through human agency, rather than randomness. Then Catherine began building the defense. She brought the stable owner to testify that Marcus was a chronic drunk who frequently rode while intoxicated. She presented the financial documents showing Marcus's gambling debts. She called a physician to testify about what the autopsy had revealed, that Marcus had a significant amount of alcohol in his system at the time of death, consistent with extreme intoxication. And then, unexpectedly, Catherine called Eleanor to testify. Eleanor had been terrified of this moment. She'd imagined the prosecution attorney tearing apart her testimony, making her look like a liar, making the jury doubt her. But Catherine had prepared her thoroughly. "Tell us about your marriage to Marcus Holloway," Catherine began gently. Eleanor spoke clearly about the unhappiness, the emotional distance, the way Marcus had thrown himself into increasingly risky behaviors. She didn't hide the fact that she'd been considering leaving him. She didn't minimize her relief when he died. "I was grieving," Eleanor said carefully. "Grief and relief can exist at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive." The prosecution attorney, a man named Thornton, stood to cross-examine. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Garrett, that you have a history of husbands dying?" he asked, his tone dripping with insinuation. "I have a history of marrying men who were ultimately unable to survive," Eleanor replied calmly. "That's not the same thing as being responsible for their deaths, but people call you cursed, don't they?" "People call me many things," Eleanor said. "Most of those things say more about people than they say about me. Isn't it possible that you developed methods for eliminating inconvenient husbands? Methods that looked like accidents?" Catherine objected. Judge Morrison sustained it. But the damage had been done. The insinuation hung in the air. For 3 days, the trial proceeded. Catherine systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. She called character witnesses who testified to Eleanor's integrity. She presented the original investigation's findings, which had concluded accidental death. She demonstrated that the Holloway family's motivation was financial desperation, not justice. And then, in his closing argument, Catherine made a statement that would be quoted in newspapers across Wyoming. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Eleanor Hartwell is a woman of mysterious powers. Someone capable of driving a man to self-destruction through some supernatural influence. But I would suggest to you that this narrative is far more convenient than the truth. The truth is that Marcus Holloway was a man with gambling debts, a drinking problem, and poor judgment. The truth is that he died as a result of his own recklessness, not because of anything Eleanor did. And the prosecution wants you to believe in curses because the alternative, accepting that tragedy is random and sometimes has nothing to do with anyone's fault, is harder to accept. The jury took 4 hours to reach a verdict. Eleanor sat in the courtroom with Thomas's hand gripping hers, barely able to breathe. "Not guilty," the foreman announced. Eleanor felt something inside her crack open and release. She'd carried the weight of this accusation for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to exist without it. But what surprised her most came after the trial ended. The Holloway family released a statement acknowledging that they'd been wrong to reopen the investigation, that they'd allowed their grief to cloud their judgment, that they'd been unfair to Eleanor. It was a public retraction, broadcast in newspapers across the territory. On the ride back to the Redemption Ranch, Eleanor sat beside Thomas and watched the landscape pass by. They'd survived. Not just the trial, but the weight of a narrative that had been trying to crush them for decades. "You know what I realize?" Eleanor said quietly. "The curse was never real, but the story of the curse was real. And that's what we had to fight. Not magic or fate, but the power of narrative, the power of other people's beliefs about who I was." Thomas squeezed her hand. "You fought it, and you won. When they arrived at the ranch, they found Sophie waiting on the porch. The girl ran down the steps and launched herself at Eleanor, holding her tight without saying anything. Some things Eleanor realized didn't need words. They'd proven that curses were just stories. Now they needed to prove that those stories could be rewritten. The weeks following Eleanor's acquittal brought an unexpected shift to Millbrook. The town's narrative, the one that had defined Eleanor for so long, had been publicly dismantled, and in its place was something far more complicated and human, the realization that they'd been wrong. People didn't like being wrong. Eleanor had learned this long ago. But being forced to acknowledge that you'd helped persecute an innocent woman was a different kind of wrong. It demanded more than casual apology. It demanded reckoning. Mrs. Henderson came to the Redemption Ranch in November, arriving by buggy on a cold afternoon. Eleanor almost didn't recognize her at first. The woman who'd seemed so formidable in Millbrook, who'd orchestrated so much of the social exclusion, looked diminished somehow, older and smaller and genuinely frightened. "I need to speak with you," Mrs. Henderson said, standing awkwardly in the ranch's parlor, hat in her hands. Eleanor gestured to a chair. "Please sit. I was wrong," Mrs. Henderson said without preamble. "I was cruel, and I was wrong, and I've spent every day since your acquittal thinking about what I said to you, what I allowed others to say. I encouraged the petition to remove you from teaching. I told people you were dangerous. I helped make your life miserable." Eleanor listened quietly. She'd imagined this conversation many times, had imagined Mrs. Henderson's apology, and had spent years preparing a response. But now that it was happening, Eleanor found herself feeling something unexpected. Compassion. "Why are you here?" Eleanor asked gently. "Because I'm ashamed," Mrs. Henderson replied simply. "And because I need to understand how someone survives what you've survived. How do you not become bitter? How do you not hate people for what they've done to you?" Eleanor considered this carefully. "I did hate for a long time. I hated my family for making me feel broken. I hated society for making shame out of something that wasn't my fault. I hated Millbrook for deciding I was a curse. But carrying that much hate, it's exhausting. And it's lonely. So when Thomas offered me another option, when he offered me the possibility of being understood instead of judged, I chose that instead." She paused. "I'm not saying I've forgiven everyone. I haven't. But I've stopped needing them to understand what happened to me. I've stopped requiring their approval or their acceptance. I've found people who believe in me, and that's been enough." Mrs. Henderson left an hour later, no grand reconciliation achieved, but something had shifted. She'd been seen, she'd been heard, and Eleanor had been generous enough to respond to her. Apology with honesty rather than recrimination, word travelled quickly through Millbrook that Eleanor had received Mrs. Henderson, not with coldness but with understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, not quite, but it was the possibility of it, and apparently that was enough to crack something open in the town's collective consciousness. More people began to reach out. Women started asking Eleanor if they could visit the ranch. Some brought gifts or supplies, some simply wanted to talk. Eleanor found herself becoming, of all things, a kind of advisor to women with complicated stories. A woman whose husband had left her came seeking guidance on how to rebuild her life. A widow struggling with grief came looking for understanding. A young girl who'd been treated cruelly by her peers came to ask Eleanor how she'd survived social exclusion. Eleanor responded to each one with the same quality of attention she'd once reserved for her students. She listened. She validated their experiences. She helped them understand that society's judgment was not the same as truth, that being labeled a certain way didn't mean they had to accept that label. Thomas watched this development with something like amusement. "You've become famous," he said one evening, as Eleanor was preparing dinner with Mrs. Violet. "I've become useful," Eleanor corrected. "There's a difference, but it was more than that. Eleanor had become a symbol, not of the curse, but of survival. She'd become proof that it was possible to be judged harshly by society and still build a good life. She'd become evidence that the stories people told about you didn't have to define your reality. The real transformation came in the spring of the following year when Sophie was invited to perform in a school recitation event. Eleanor had worried that Sophie would still experience social exclusion, that the sins of the mother would be visited upon the daughter. But what she discovered was that Sophie, given the choice to be bitter or generous, had chosen generosity. Sophie had befriended the children who'd been kindest to her. She'd forgiven the ones who'd been cruel. She'd moved forward with a resilience that Eleanor recognized as something beyond her teaching and more essential than genetics. It was the resilience of someone who'd been given unconditional love and had learned to extend that love outward. Sophie stood on the small stage at the schoolhouse and recited a poem she'd selected herself, a poem about transformation and growth and the seasons changing. Eleanor watched from the audience beside Thomas and Margaret, who'd come to visit for the season, and felt something settle into place inside her chest. This, she thought, this is what it means to have broken the curse, not through magic or destiny, but through the simple act of refusing to believe it anymore. After the recitation, people congratulated Sophie. Even Martha Ashford, Tommy's mother, approached Eleanor privately to say that she'd been thinking about how she'd treated her and how she regretted it deeply. "People were just afraid," Martha said. "When we don't understand something, we make up stories to make sense of it." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "And when we make up scary stories, we hurt people." "I know," Martha said quietly. "I'm trying to do better. It wasn't perfect reconciliation. Millbrook wasn't suddenly transformed into a place of perfect acceptance and understanding. But it was better. It was more human. It was a place where people were attempting to see each other rather than simply judge from a distance." By summer, Thomas had made a significant expansion to the Redemption Ranch. He'd hired 3 additional workers and had begun training Sophie in the practical management of the property. Eleanor watched her daughter ride horses with genuine skill, watch her negotiate with suppliers, observe her learning the business side of ranching. Sophie was becoming someone independent and competent, someone who would never have to depend on another person's approval to know her own worth. One evening, Eleanor found Thomas in the study, going over account books. He looked up when she entered. "Catherine Pierce sent a telegram," he said, gesturing to the paper on his desk. "She's written a law review article about your case. She's using it as an example of how narratives can be weaponized against women and how legal defense needs to account for that." Eleanor picked up the telegram and read it twice. "Is that good or bad?" "It's historically significant," Thomas replied. "It means that what happened to you, what you survived, is going to help protect other women from similar persecution. Catherine's arguing that courts need to be skeptical of character-based accusations without substantial evidence. She's using your case as the precedent." Eleanor felt something like peace settle over her. Her pain had been transformed into something useful. The curse, that terrible narrative that had defined so much of her life, had become a tool for helping other people avoid similar persecution. That night, Eleanor sat on the porch of the Redemption Ranch and looked out at the land that had become home. Margaret had returned to Omaha, but she came to visit regularly now. Sophie was asleep inside, having worn herself out with ranch work and schooling. Thomas was in the study working on next year's expansion plans. And Eleanor was alone with her thoughts for the first time in months. She thought about the girl she'd been when she married Marcus Holloway. Young, hopeful, convinced that marriage was supposed to be the answer to every question about what came next. She thought about the woman she'd become after his death, haunted, ashamed, convinced that she was responsible for tragedy beyond her control. She thought about Eleanor at 30. Burying her third husband and nearly drowning in grief and judgment. She thought about Eleanor at 32, arriving in Millbrook broken and isolated, looking for a place to disappear, and she thought about Eleanor now, at 34, sitting on a porch that belonged to her, married to a man who'd chosen her despite everything, mother to a daughter who was thriving, adopted by a community that had learned to see her as a person rather than a cautionary tale. The curse had never been real, but the journey away from believing in the curse, that had been real. That had mattered. That had changed everything. Thomas found her on the porch an hour later. He sat beside her without speaking, and they existed together in the comfortable silence of people who'd chosen each other and were still choosing every single day. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "Marrying me with all the complications and the judgment?" Thomas considered this carefully. "Never, not for 1 second. Do you regret it?" "No," Eleanor replied immediately. "I'm grateful. I'm grateful that you were brave enough to love me. I'm grateful that you showed me it was possible to survive judgment without being destroyed by it. I'm grateful that you gave Sophie a home and a family and a father who actually stays." "We gave Sophie those things," Thomas corrected gently. "You're her mother. You're the one who taught her how to survive." "I just provided the infrastructure," Eleanor smiled. "I think we did it together. That's what I've learned, actually. That's what surviving the curse really meant, learning how to ask for help, learning that I didn't have to carry everything alone, learning that other people could be trusted, that love could be real, that it was possible to build something lasting." They sat together as the sun set over the mountains. Two people who'd both been marked by tragedy and had chosen to transform that marking into something else entirely. The curse, if it had ever existed, was broken now. Not through magic or fate, but through the simple, ordinary, extraordinary power of choosing each other. 2 years after Eleanor's acquittal, the Redemption Ranch had transformed from a functioning property into a genuinely prosperous enterprise. Thomas's vision of expansion had been realized methodically and carefully. The herd had doubled in size. The hay production had increased significantly. They'd built new structures, hired competent workers, and established trade relationships with ranches and merchants across the territory. But success brought complications that Eleanor hadn't anticipated. The first sign of trouble came from one of Thomas's longtime workers, a man named Robert, who'd been with the ranch since before Eleanor arrived. Robert pulled Thomas aside one afternoon and mentioned, carefully and with obvious discomfort, that some of the newer workers were uncomfortable taking direction from Eleanor on certain ranch matters. "They don't mean disrespect," Robert explained, his weathered face apologetic, "but there's talk that a woman shouldn't be handling certain aspects of the business, contracts, negotiations with other ranchers, that sort of thing." Eleanor overheard this conversation and found Thomas in the barn afterward, clearly agitated. "I don't care what they think," Thomas said immediately when Eleanor brought it up. "You're my wife. You're part owner of this ranch. You have every right to be involved in business decisions." "But they're uncomfortable," Eleanor pointed out. "And I understand why, actually. Society says women shouldn't involve themselves in commerce. It says our minds aren't suited for business." "Society is wrong," Thomas replied firmly. "Society was also wrong about you being cursed, and we managed to prove that." Eleanor smiled, despite the seriousness of the situation. "This is different. This isn't about judgment or cruelty. This is about tradition and expectation. This is about men believing, genuinely believing, that they're protecting women from things we're not equipped to handle." "So what do you want to do?" Thomas asked. Eleanor considered this. "I want to show them that I can handle it, not by fighting them directly, but by being so competent that they can't deny my capability." What followed was a deliberate strategy that Eleanor implemented over the course of several months. She began attending all business meetings, not as a silent observer, but as an active participant. She asked detailed questions about contracts and terms. She researched market prices for cattle and hay. She learned the intricacies of negotiation by watching Thomas and then by practicing herself with smaller transactions. When a merchant from Helena came to negotiate the purchase of a large quantity of hay, Eleanor handled the negotiation herself. She asked better questions than Thomas would have. She identified places where the merchant was trying to underprice their product. She walked away from the negotiation when the terms weren't favorable, and then had the merchant come back with an improved offer. The deal Eleanor negotiated saved the ranch nearly $500 compared to what the merchant had initially proposed. When the ranch workers heard about it, the narrative shifted. Eleanor wasn't a wife trying to involve herself in her husband's business. Eleanor was a skilled negotiator who was improving the ranch's profitability. That was harder to dismiss as inappropriate. Robert approached Eleanor a few weeks later, his hat in his hands, his expression earnest. "I spoke with some of the men," he said. "We've been thinking about how we treated this situation. We were wrong. You clearly know what you're doing, and you've made us all money by making better deals. We'd be fools to question your involvement." Eleanor accepted his apology with grace, though she noted that apology seemed to come more easily when competence was demonstrated than when basic human decency had been violated. But perhaps, she reflected, that was simply how change worked in the world, one small victory at a time, one demonstrated capability at a time. Meanwhile, Sophie was transitioning from student to something more complex. Now, 16 years old and possessed of genuine intelligence and determination, Sophie had begun asking Thomas about what came after the ranch. She wanted to understand whether she'd be expected to marry, to settle into the traditional role of a woman managing a household, or whether there were other possibilities. Eleanor listened as Thomas and Sophie discussed this one evening in the ranch's study. "I could teach," Sophie suggested, "like Mother did. I enjoy working with children, and I've learned enough to be an effective teacher." "You could," Thomas agreed. "Or you could do what your mother has done here, become involved in business management. You could run this ranch with someone, or you could go to a city and work in commerce." Sophie's eyes widened at the possibilities. "Is that actually possible?" "For women, it's difficult," Eleanor interjected, joining the conversation. "Society resists it, but it's possible if you're willing to work harder than men around you, and if you're willing to accept that not everyone will approve of your choices." "I think I'd like to try," Sophie said quietly. "I'd like to learn the business side of ranching properly. Not just helping, but actually understanding how to run an operation." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances. They'd both survived living according to other people's expectations. They'd learned that the cost of that compliance was too high. They'd chosen to build something different for Sophie, to give her options rather than requirements, possibilities rather than predetermined paths. "Then we'll teach you," Thomas said, "everything we know." But the expansion of Eleanor's role created an unexpected tension. Thomas found himself increasingly stepping back from certain decisions. He was allowing Eleanor to make calls that had previously been his domain. He was trusting her judgment in ways that seemed to threaten his sense of control. It came to a head one evening when Eleanor made a significant decision regarding the purchase of additional grazing land without consulting Thomas first. "I had the information," Eleanor explained when Thomas expressed his frustration. "The opportunity was time-sensitive. The price was good. We had the capital. I made the decision." "Without asking me," Thomas replied, and Eleanor could hear something wounded beneath his words. "Would you have made a different choice?" Eleanor asked. "That's not the point," Thomas said. "The point is that we should be making these decisions together." "We are making them together," Eleanor replied carefully. "But I also need to be able to make decisions independently sometimes. If I have to check with you for permission every time I want to take an action, then I'm not actually a partner. I'm just an extension of your will." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor could see him working through something internally, wrestling with expectations and reality. "I don't want to be that kind of husband," Thomas said finally. "I don't want to be the kind of man who needs to control his wife. But I'm realizing that's what I'm expecting without realizing it. I'm expecting you to defer to me, to check with me, to let me be the final authority. And that's exactly what you've been running from your entire life." He sat down heavily. "I'm sorry. I need to think about what kind of man I actually want to be." What followed was not a fight, but a reckoning. Thomas spent time processing his expectations about marriage and partnership. He recognized that he'd been raised with certain assumptions about male authority within the household, and that those assumptions, while normal by the standards of their society, were in direct contradiction to what he claimed to believe about Eleanor's capacity and worth. "I want you to be your own person," Thomas said, "but part of me also wants to be important. I want to feel necessary, and when you make decisions without me, I feel less." "You're still necessary," Eleanor replied gently, "but not as a gatekeeper, not as someone who has to approve of my actions. You're necessary as a partner, someone I can talk to about decisions, someone whose perspective matters, someone I trust. But I need to be able to act independently sometimes, and I need you to trust that I'm capable of doing that without your permission." Over the next month, Eleanor and Thomas renegotiated the terms of their partnership, not in words, but in action. Eleanor continued to make independent decisions. Thomas learned to trust those decisions without feeling threatened by them. They developed a rhythm where Eleanor would sometimes consult Thomas and sometimes wouldn't, depending on the urgency and nature of the decision. Thomas learned to ask questions about decisions Eleanor had made, not from a place of wanting to override them, but from genuine curiosity about her reasoning. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it represented something significant, the recognition that partnership wasn't about one person deferring to another, but about two people maintaining their individual agency while also building something together. One afternoon, Eleanor found Thomas in the study, looking at a map of the ranch and the surrounding property. "I've been thinking," he said, "what if we established a school here on the ranch? Not just for Sophie, but for ranch families in the area. You could teach, and it would be something concrete, something lasting that we built together." Eleanor studied the map. "You'd do that?" "Why wouldn't I?" Thomas asked. "You're brilliant at teaching. You've proven you're brilliant at business. Why shouldn't we build something that showcases both of those things?" What Thomas was offering, Eleanor realized, was not just a project, but a recognition. He was saying that Eleanor's ideas were worth investing in, that her capabilities deserved infrastructure, that she wasn't just his wife, but his intellectual partner in building something. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning what the school might look like. By the time dinner was ready, Eleanor and Thomas had sketched out a preliminary design for a small schoolhouse that could serve the surrounding ranch. Community. Sophie came home from an afternoon ride and found them, still poring over the plans. "What is this?" Sophie asked, looking at the sketches. "Our new project," Eleanor said. "Your father is going to build a school on the ranch, and I'm going to run it, teaching the children of ranch workers and neighboring families." Sophie looked at Thomas, then at Eleanor, then back at the plans. "This is exactly what you both do best," she said simply. "You see a problem, in this case, lack of education for ranch children, and you solve it. What's the problem you're going to solve?" Eleanor asked her daughter. Sophie smiled. "I'm still figuring that out. But I know that by the time I'm your age, I'm going to have something to show for my life. Something I built, not something that was built for me." Eleanor felt something settle into place inside her chest. They were building a legacy together. Not just the physical expansion of the ranch, but the expansion of what was possible for the people within their sphere of influence. Sophie was learning that she had agency. The women Eleanor mentored were learning that they could survive judgment. The ranch workers were learning that competence was more important than gender. The curse had never been real. But what Eleanor and Thomas were building now was very real indeed. It was a life deliberately constructed where each person got to be fully themselves rather than a diminished version of themselves designed to fit others' expectations. That was worth more than survival. That was worth more than vindication. That was worth everything Eleanor had sacrificed to get here. 5 years after Eleanor married Thomas Garrett, Millbrook held a town celebration in her honor. It wasn't something Eleanor had anticipated or wanted, but Mrs. Patterson had coordinated with the town council, and apparently there was consensus that Eleanor's presence had fundamentally transformed the community in ways worth acknowledging. The celebration was held on a warm September evening in the town square. Lanterns hung from every available surface, casting pools of warm light across the gathered crowd. Eleanor stood beside Thomas and Sophie, watching people arrive, people who'd been her harshest critics, people who'd whispered the word curse like it was an incantation designed to ward off evil. The schoolmaster, Frederick Walsh, stood to address the crowd. He spoke about Eleanor's contributions to education, about how her willingness to teach had changed the lives of dozens of children. He spoke about how her character, demonstrated through her consistent grace in the face of injustice, had taught the town something about compassion. But the most powerful speech came from Martha Ashford, mother of the boy Eleanor had defended Sophie against years earlier. "I want to speak about what I did," Martha said, her voice carrying across the square. "I was cruel to Eleanor Hartwell. I participated in spreading rumors. I encouraged my son to treat her daughter poorly. I did these things not out of malice but out of fear. I was afraid of what I didn't understand, and instead of trying to understand, I joined in the judgment." She paused, her composure visibly wavering. 3 years ago, my husband became ill. It was a lengthy illness that left us nearly bankrupt from medical costs. Eleanor Garrett came to me during that time and asked if there was anything she could do to help. She brought food. She brought money she could ill afford to give. She sat with me during the darkest moments, and I realized that this woman I'd spent years demonizing was actually one of the most genuinely good people I'd ever known. Martha wiped her eyes. The curse was never real. What was real was our decision to believe in it. What was real was our willingness to judge without understanding. And what's real now is our opportunity to be better than we were. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself surrounded by people wanting to speak with her, to thank her, to apologize for past cruelties. Some of these apologies felt genuine. Some felt performative, as though people wanted credit for forgiving Eleanor now that it was socially acceptable to do so. But Eleanor had learned to distinguish between true reconciliation and social performance. She accepted the apologies with grace, but without false intimacy. She was grateful to people who genuinely changed their behavior and perspectives. But she wasn't obligated to pretend that years of cruelty could be erased by an evening of kind words. After the official celebration ended, Eleanor slipped away from the crowd and found herself walking toward the schoolhouse where she'd first taught in Millbrook years ago. Thomas found her there, standing in the darkened building, looking at the desks where she'd struggled to reach children in a place that hadn't wanted her. "Regretting anything?" Thomas asked gently. "No," Eleanor replied. "But I was thinking about who I was when I first walked into this building. I was so scared. I was so convinced that I was broken, and that this place was going to expose that brokenness. And now," Thomas prompted, "now I understand that I was never broken," Eleanor said. "The world was broken in the way it treated women, the way it blamed victims, the way it created narratives to explain away injustice. But I was never the problem. I was just a person trying to survive in a system designed to make survival difficult." They returned to the Redemption Ranch to find Sophie waiting on the porch. The girl, now a young woman of 21, had spent the evening coordinating with some of the schoolchildren to practice a performance for the celebration. She'd grown into something remarkable, intelligent, kind, grounded in her own sense of self-worth, uninterested in pretense or social performance. "How was it?" Sophie asked. "Complicated," Eleanor replied honestly. "People wanting to believe they were good all along. People wanting credit for finally seeing me as a person rather than a cautionary tale." Sophie nodded with understanding. "Do you wish they'd been better sooner?" Eleanor considered this. Of course. It would have been easier if Millbrook had welcomed me instead of condemning me. But if that had happened, I probably wouldn't have become who I am. I would have settled. I would have been content with less. The cruelty forced me to be strong. Over the following months, Eleanor saw the results of the evening celebration manifest in tangible ways. More families wanted their children educated at the Redemption Ranch School, which had been formally established 2 years earlier. Eleanor had hired 2 additional teachers to handle the expanding enrollment. The school had become a genuine community institution, but more importantly, Eleanor noticed that other women in Millbrook, women with their own complications, their own judgments, their own stories, were beginning to speak more openly about their experiences. They were beginning to question the narratives they'd been told about themselves. One woman came to Eleanor privately to confess that she'd been blamed for her husband's business failure, when in reality, he'd made poor decisions and spent money recklessly. Another woman spoke about how she'd been labeled barren by her community, when the truth was that she'd chosen not to have children. Another woman shared that she'd been treated as shameful for not remarrying after her husband's death, when she'd actually been content with her independence. Eleanor listened to each of these stories and recognized her own echoed in them. She'd learned something crucial during her years of persecution. The stories society told about women, about their failures, their inadequacies, their responsibilities, were often designed not to help women, but to control them. In the spring of their 6th year of marriage, Eleanor received a letter that would change the trajectory of her life once again. It came from Catherine Pierce, the lawyer who'd defended her during the Marcus Holloway trial. Catherine wrote to tell Eleanor that she'd been asked to speak at a women's legal society gathering in Denver, and she wanted Eleanor to join her, to tell her story to a room full of women who were fighting for legal rights and protections. Eleanor showed the letter to Thomas that evening. "You should go," he said immediately. "This is exactly what you're meant to do, help other women understand that they're not responsible for things beyond their control." "But the ranch," Eleanor began. "We'll be fine," Thomas interrupted. "Sophie can help manage things. Mrs. Violet can oversee the household. I'm capable of handling problems that arise. And more importantly, you need to do this." Eleanor traveled to Denver with Catherine and spent 2 days speaking to a room full of women about her experiences. She spoke about the cursed narrative that had defined her life. She spoke about how society blamed women for circumstances beyond their control. She spoke about how the legal system had finally vindicated her when the court of public opinion had condemned her. But more importantly, she spoke about agency. She spoke about the power of choosing your own narrative rather than accepting the one society had written for you. She spoke about the difference between survival and thriving, between accepting judgment and refusing it. The women responded with a hunger Eleanor hadn't anticipated. They asked questions about how to reclaim their reputations. They asked how to navigate a world that blamed them for things they hadn't done. They asked if it was possible to build a good life after being labeled a failure. Eleanor answered each question with honesty drawn from her own hard-won understanding. Yes, it was possible. No, it wasn't easy. Yes, other people might never change their minds about you, but that didn't have to matter if you were firm enough in your own conviction that you were worthy. When Eleanor returned to the Redemption Ranch, she found that Thomas had implemented something significant. He'd begun the process of putting the ranch into Eleanor's name, not jointly with him, but solely hers. Why? Eleanor asked, shocked by this development. Because I want you to have something that's entirely yours, Thomas explained. Something that no one can question, that no one can take away, that's yours to make decisions about, independently. I want you to have the security that comes from owning something outright. But we built this together, Eleanor protested. We did, Thomas agreed. But I have the security of a man. I can walk into banks and be believed. I can make decisions without people questioning my competence or my motives. You shouldn't have to share ownership of something you've worked so hard to build. You should have something that's entirely, unquestionably yours. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. This gesture, this absolute rejection of traditional marriage structures in favor of genuine partnership, represented everything they'd been building together. It represented Thomas's genuine belief in Eleanor's capability and worth. It represented a marriage based on choice rather than obligation, on partnership rather than control. A year later, Eleanor stood in the Denver courthouse as Catherine Pierce presented oral arguments in a case involving a woman accused of causing her husband's business failure. The arguments that Catherine made were built on precedents established in Eleanor's trial. The judge, when he made his decision ruling in favor of the woman, specifically cited Eleanor's case as evidence that character-based accusations without substantial proof should not be sufficient to condemn someone. Eleanor's story, the story of the cursed widow, had become more than just her own survival. It had become a legal precedent. It had become evidence that could be used to protect other women from similar persecution. Years later, when Eleanor was in her 60s and Sophie was grown and married and running her own ranching operation, a young woman appeared at the Redemption Ranch with a worn newspaper clipping about Eleanor's trial. The young woman, unmarried, accused by her community of being somehow responsible for her fiancé's sudden death, came seeking guidance. Eleanor recognized herself in that young woman's fear. She recognized the weight of carrying accusations that weren't yours to carry. The curse was never real, Eleanor told her, as she'd told so many others. What was real was a system designed to blame women for things beyond their control. What was real was a community that needed someone to demonize, so they didn't have to question their own assumptions. But you are not responsible for tragedy. You are not responsible for circumstances beyond your control. You are only responsible for how you respond to those circumstances. The young woman left the Redemption Ranch with something Eleanor had given her, the knowledge that survival was possible, that it was okay to be angry at injustice, and that building a good life in spite of judgment was an act of profound courage. As Eleanor watched the young woman ride away, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the girl who'd arrived in Millbrook broken and afraid, convinced that she was cursed. She thought about the woman she'd become, someone who'd learned that curses were just stories, and that stories could be rewritten if you were brave enough to do it. The Redemption Ranch stood around her, a monument to what two broken people could build together when they chose to believe in each other despite fear. Sophie was thriving, passing on to her own children the understanding that they could be anything they wanted to be. Thomas was peaceful, content with a life that had been hard-won and genuinely earned, and Eleanor was finally, completely at peace with who she was. Not because the world had changed its judgment of her, though some of it had, but because she'd learned to trust her own judgment of herself. The curse was broken. Not because magic existed, but because Eleanor had learned that the only power anyone ever had over her was the power she gave them. And she'd spent these years teaching that same lesson to everyone who came seeking it. That was her real legacy. Not the ranch, not the school, not even the legal precedent, though all of those mattered. Her real legacy was the permission she gave other people to stop believing the damaging stories society told about them. Her real legacy was the proof that even when everything was stacked against you, even when the entire world seemed determined to define you as a curse, it was still possible to choose a different story. It was still possible to thrive. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.